Hi, Ern.
Good afternoon, Lionel. Hi,
Yeah,
everyone.
glad to see that you can give us some of your time. I'm very excited about this. And so here we have Ern. He is the head of sustainable and impact investment for LGT. So I'm not going to steal his thunder. I'll let him introduce himself. So over to you, Ern.
Excellent. Thank you, Lionel. Very good afternoon to all of you. Um, Lionel tells me that there are many of you out there virtually, so really great to connect and share this time with all of you. As many of you know, sustainable finance has reached a lot of global momentum, that's what people say. So we thought it would be helpful here to have this hour with all of you to share a little bit about the industry developments, to share a little bit about my career journey. But most importantly, we're here for all of you to, in a way, to help navigate the changing landscape, to help navigate the opportunities as well as potential challenges to avoid. And so, I hope the conversation today will be engaging, meaningful, and interactive. So first and foremost, my name is En Li, and I lead the Sustainable Impact Investment portfolio in Asia for LGT. LGT is a private banking and asset management firm. What makes us unique is that we're wholly owned by a single family, and that family is the princely family of Liechtenstein. And I really have the privilege of working with a long legacy family because they have a unique history of over 900 years across 26 generations.
Wow.
So it's actually very appropriate that we talk about sustainability because when you work for a shareholder and owner and a family that looks across generations, that's where sustainability and sustainable investing are very, very important. So really, really great to share some of our lessons learned over the last at least 10 years that I've been with the firm.
Okay, thanks. When we have this type of conversation, and the first question we always ask is, did you wake up one day and decide to do what you're doing? Because I understand you have a background in legal.
Yeah, I have quite a diverse background actually, not just legal. I would say that this is my fourth career.
Okay.
So, for those of you that don't know me, I'm actually Singaporean, but I spent more than 2 decades overseas. I grew up in a variety of places from Sydney in Australia, London, Hong Kong, and then I came back to Singapore almost about 1.5 decades ago. So when I first started my career, I came from a pretty conservative family. My parents were doctors, so my career options were limited to three. They were medicine, law, and engineering. So I chose, in my view, the lesser of the three evils, and that was law. So actually, my first career was as a lawyer, as a corporate lawyer. And then from there, I moved to investment banking. Um, and then from there, that brought me to the global financial crisis. And this is an inflection point for maybe some of you on the call today as well, that really at that point, I resonated very much with an Einstein quote that said, "Do not be a person of success, be a person of value." And I realized that although at quite a young age, I'd achieved quite a lot of material success, some of that was actually inconsistent with my personal and professional values. So
Hmm.
that's when after the GFC, the financial crisis in 2009, I actually took a year out to pursue my passion, which was to be a travel editor. So I actually
Oh,
traveled to many, many places in the world, all of them in nature, so including some of the ancient natural modern wonders. And I was a photographer doing lots of conservation projects. And I would say that it's really in that 1 year gap that I started reading very widely. And that's when I got to know about impact investing. It wasn't even it was barely even a term then, let alone sustainable finance and sustainable investing. But I knew very much that I wanted to go in that direction because of a few things. The first core belief was that I still believe in the transformative power of capital. Okay. My years before that showed me that. But unfortunately, the way that capitalism has developed has been all about profit. It didn't
mm,
factor in
mm,
sort of the
mm.
positive, sometimes even negative social and environmental outcomes that come with an investment. So that's why I wanted to move towards sustainable and impact investing with the ideal that I wanted to use that transformative power of capital, but using that to drive not just strong returns, but strong environmental and social outcomes. And that's really what brought me into the space. So it's really after that realization that I have been in sector for about 14 years now, and most of that was has been with LGT.
Oh, okay. So that's a very, very interesting, very, very interesting journey. So, you know, I think you touched on it a little bit just now, but you know, what exactly do you do?
Mm. So, Lionel, you and I had a few conversations about this. So one thing great about sustainability and sustainable investing is quite a buzzword. So a lot of people have heard about it. But unfortunately, the flip side is that a lot of people are quite confused by it as well, because it's going through a
Mm,
little bit of a hype cycle where people know about it, but the terms are used interchangeably. So what I thought might be quite useful is to try to demystify and simplify, right? So I think let's start off first with the big picture. What is sustainability and what's sustainable investing? Now, if
mm,
I focus on sustainability first, it just broadly means to do something today so that in future things thrive, right? Whether that's
mm,
the way
mm,
they operate, whether that's the way business operate, whether that's the combination of that in harmony with society and nature. Now, you bring in the concept of investing and how does one invest sustainably? It's the same idea, right? How do I invest today such that future generations can thrive? And when I say future generations, I'm not just talking about society. I'm talking about the natural ecosystem that needs to thrive along with it. And sometimes we have that disconnect. So I think that's first and foremost the thematic. Now, I know you and I had talked a little bit about this, but I
mhm,
quite like to say that sustainable investing, since that's the topic of today, there are a range of approaches, and I quite like to simplify it into the A, B's, and C's. One type of approach focuses on the A, which stands for avoiding harm. Okay?
mm,
Avoiding harm, for example, might mean taking out the sin industries, no tobacco,
okay.
no alcohol, no ammunitions, etc. That means essentially avoiding the bad. But the next section, the next approach, which is the B, is how do you ensure that you don't just take out the bad, but you're benefiting stakeholders? And we notice very carefully when we say stakeholders and not shareholders, right? Stakeholders is a much wider base that can include your shareholders, but it also includes your producers, your suppliers, your employees, the communities where your operations are. It's a much broader base. Now, for the B, that's when approaches like ESG, I'm sure many of you have heard about environmental social governance frameworks. That's when they have a particular relevance in understanding the stakeholder base because you're looking across the environmental footprint, how you're sourcing the energy, what is your carbon footprint, how you're getting rid of your waste, is there proper diversity, is there proper governance, and so forth, right? So that's really the B. Now, the
Mm,
C is what we as a firm and myself are particularly passionate about because the C stands for contribute to solutions. So in my view, it's not good enough to remove the harm, ensure that your
mhm,
stakeholders are being fairly treated, that means they're benefiting, but it's important to be proactively solving the challenge. Now, whether the solution lies in healthcare, education, agriculture, financial inclusion, it could be a variety of sectors. But that's when the C really comes in. And that's where approaches like impact investing, which is ultimately a proactive form of investing, where you hold yourself accountable, not just to drive profits, but you're also trying to drive meaningful and measurable social and environmental outcomes. So if there's one thing I like to make sure all of you remember in sustainable investing is think a little bit about which approach resonates with you, A, B, or C. And
mm.
sometimes it's all of the above.
I see. So in your area of work, which all three of them plays equal parts, or you place emphasis on certain one of them?
Yeah, again, that's a really good question. And that sort of brings me to the second key distinction that's
Mm-hmm.
very important to understand because when you're dealing with the capital markets, it's a very, very large asset class that goes across very different asset class within that field, right? So generally speaking, to simplify, there is both the public markets, so that's traded stocks, bonds, funds, ETFs, etc. And there's private markets, which generally refers to venture capital, private equity, and private debt. things which are not
Oh,
traded.
okay.
Okay.
Mm,
So for those of you that are on the call today, if you take that screen of the ABC, you can use them very differently across the different asset classes. So as a firm, to answer your question, Lionel, as
mhm.
LGT, we obviously are very active in both public and private markets.
I see.
For my day job, however, when I talk about the investments that I manage and I help to create value, they're largely in the private markets. They're essentially private equity in some stages, earlier stage venture capital investments that we use to drive impact. And it's important to understand how you use the different approaches across the different asset classes. Because, for example, if you and I are buying stocks, say we're buying stocks in Tesla, we have the
Mm,
ability to thematically choose a stock that we think is good for the environment because maybe it's electric mobility like Tesla. But at the same time, we don't really have the ability to call Elon and call the management team and have that control, right?
really?
And the way that stocks and shares are traded, they're traded on a very short-term basis. When the market moves up a quarter, people sell. You don't really sort of have a long-term view and hold and build. Whereas if you use the ABC framework in the private markets, these are markets where we are taking individual ownership in companies. We generally look very long term, in some cases, 5, 10, even 15 years in some cases, right?
Mm,
And in addition to having that ownership, we take a board seat and we also have control. We have the ability to influence the management teams. So when you're thinking about how one drives value and how one drives impact, that same approach, whether or not it's in private markets and public markets, could be very different. So I guess flipping it around for many of you that are thinking about career in this space, think
mm,
about which asset class resonates with your skill set and your interest, and also where you're inclined to be. Obviously, private markets are a little bit longer in terms of the orientation towards how long you hold an investment versus something in the public markets, which is more of a tradable mindset.
mm. And how does it, do you think, link up with the recent launch of the job transformation map?
Mm. So very, very excited. To see the MAS launch the Job Transformation Max specifically for sustainable finance
Mm-hmm.
careers. I think they did that in April, right? So
April, yes.
yeah, a couple of weeks ago. So I read through it and it's very, very interesting because just a couple of highlights, so all of you are aware. Number one is obviously with MAS excellent work in trying to drive generally Singapore as a leading sustainable finance hub, right? They have also estimated that the market for Asia for sustainable finance is really going to grow pretty rapidly. And
Mm,
along with that would be a plethora of jobs in various areas, right?
mm,
And using what I mentioned earlier, even in banking or asset management, there are a whole bunch of different jobs in banking, and even banking, whether it's retail banking, commercial banking, or in our case, in LGT, private banking, right? There are all these different jobs that are coming in. Same with the asset management industry as well, which is essentially, in the fund management industry, in the investment management industry, there are a whole bunch of jobs that are coming up. I would liken it in a way to when I started my career a few decades ago, technology was a big thing. But when I started
mm.
my career, technology was often seen as one sector.
I see. Yeah.
But as technology grew in importance, it broadened to affect all sectors. And I see the same thing happening with sustainability. In many cases, a decade ago, there were very specific sustainability teams. Now, sustainability, at least within the confines of a bank or an asset manager, is integrated sustainability roles across the whole firm. So if you take private banking, what that may mean, it might be in a compliance role, it might be in
Mm.
a legal role, it might be a risk management role. It might be in an analyst role. It might be a portfolio or investment role. And it may also be in the relationship management role. It's important that all these roles understand the megatrend of sustainable investing because it's only here to stay and arguably will only get more important.
So can you give an example? If I'm a relationship manager, how would this rise in sustainable finance affect how I'm going to do things moving forward?
Yes. So I think, if you look at the jobs transformation map, it makes this distinction between functional capabilities
Mm-hmm.
and technical or thematic
Know-how. Yeah.
capability. right?
Mhm.
So, for example, if you use your example, Lionel, say we're all relationship managers today, serving the interests of our high net worth clients. It could be an
Mm,
individual, it could be families.
mhm,
So
mhm.
you might have a scenario where you have a family, for example. Let's create a fictitious one. Maybe
Yeah,
they're out of
sure.
Indonesia, and because as Indonesian, many of the families actually
Excuse me.
own land, right? Some of that land is palm oil. So that relationship manager may first start the discussion saying, Mr. and Mrs. So and so, do you actually realize that quite a lot of your family's assets are in farms and palm oil that actually is very prone to climate risk and therefore also very
Mm,
prone to financial risk and reputational risk, right? So they might start the conversation from a risk perspective. So that RM, for example, needs to be able to articulate what are some of these sustainability factors that weigh on the portfolio performance of that particular client. Then when the client says, oh, wow, okay, I hear you now. Maybe we should be divesting some of this. Maybe we should be reducing our concentration in farms, for example, but
mm,
going to something that's more climate resilient. What can you suggest? And at that point of time, the RM also has to say, oh, wow, given the fact that, sustainable investing is gaining importance, what are some of the key sectors that we like? Is it electric mobility? Is it climate solutions, right? Is it healthcare? Is it education? You see, that RM needs to be able to bring in some of these thematic capabilities in addition to the functional capabilities of the relationship management into that discussion. And then the last piece, which I should definitely add as well, is that sustainability has a combination of hardware and software.
mm,
Hardware is just the facts and what I told you, how well the investment is doing. But a lot of times, a lot of family clients that we see, particularly the family offices in Asia out of Singapore, they want to do sustainable investing because ultimately they are trying to preserve the identity and the values of the family and pass it on to the next generation. So sustainable investing is one way to ensure that, maybe a generation one founder might actually want to pass to his children or his grandchildren or her grandchildren, right?
mm,
So that's why I'm saying that even as an RM, because you're managing not just the wealth, but you're also managing the long-term family interest, this is when sometimes sustainable investing, which is used as a way to have a deeper conversation about family values, right? How you pass on that intergenerational wealth, how you pass on that intergenerational values, right? So that's also maybe on the software side, but it's equally important, sometimes even more important.
mm. Interesting, because having said that, that means that, the the skills to do well um, not only includes the technical know-how, as you said, to know what is it all about, it's also a collection of competence in gaining trust, I suppose, because it's very important as a RM, and to be able to convince and explain to the stakeholder what is it all about and what does it encompass. So would you say that a person who is wanting to, be in this, let's say, the space of self finance, um, it seems like they really need to do the walk and not just do the talk.
That is very true, Lionel. I think, as we talked, I mentioned earlier in the call that we're going through a little bit of a hype cycle. Now, hype
Mm,
cycles are not necessarily bad because the good thing with hype cycles is that, it becomes mainstream. So people are aware of
yeah.
sustainability, people are aware of ESG, there's greater interest. So that's all good. But the bad thing about hype cycles is that sometimes people that are not authentic come into the sector. Okay, we've
Mm,
seen that happen with sectors before. And one of the things I think, agreeing with what you mentioned and your observation is that sustainability, because it's going through a little bit of the hype cycle, there are risks such as like impact or greenwashing, right?
mm,
Where essentially, investors or in products are claiming to have positive social and environmental value, but actually not really caring about it or actually achieving it. And in the same way that if you are a professional in the sustainable investment arena, if your personal conviction is not there and you're just selling a product which you really don't believe in, it's very, very hard to have that conviction when you sell. Because when you deal with clients and people that are genuinely interested and say, oh, tell me more about this, would you put your money behind the product? If you don't speak with that conviction, really understand the area, that's when there's a little bit of a disconnect in that value proposition. So I think one thing, just to maybe frame it differently, is as the rise of sustainable finance roles increases, more and more firms will be not just assessing caliber, right,
Mm,
on the competency side. I mean, it's not just the functional competency and the thematic, but they'll be also assessing character. How authentic, how much conviction do you have in the space? Are you personally, in your terms, walking the talk?
mm. So how would you, if you're doing an interview now, if I come in, what would you like to see, on my resume, just to, to give you an idea that I'm really serious about this thing? I mean, after all, I can always write, I'm passionate about saving the world. I want to give my future generation something to lean on. So what was it that you would typically look at? Or perhaps the question that you ask me.
Yeah. So I think I'll break it down in a way to the three things, right? So
All right.
obviously, TV, the first thing people look for is the actual competencies, right?
Mm,
So whether or not you're trying to apply for role in legal compliance, you're trying to apply for a role in product sales, you're trying to apply for investment related role, that core competency or the must be there. Then if
mm,
you're trying to pivot to something related to sustainability, that thematic competency must be there. And maybe I didn't mention it earlier, but just for I guess
mm,
for the audience to really understand, one of the things that MAS has also done earlier this year is to launch the Singapore Sustainable Finance Association, the SSFA for short, really with the intention to galvanize knowledge, talent, but also build Singapore as a leading sustainable finance hub in Asia and the world. So have a look at the website. You can see that there are sort of five key thematic work streams. They include carbon markets, transition finance, blended finance, natural capital, and taxonomy. So, in other words, when you think about a thematic skill set, these are kind of the main themes that one should be focusing on. So, if I bring that together, say for example, if you are a risk or legal background, that's your
mm-hmm,
functional
mm-hmm,
competency, but you're very interested in getting involved in decarbonization, right?
mm,
That's the technical or the thematic skill you need to learn, right? And you might, for example, because you're applying for a job in aviation or marine, which is actually a very highly carbon intensive industry. So you're there to help mitigate that risk and to help decarbonize the supply chain. Then I will be trying to focus on understanding those two competencies. The first one typically follows your career path. The second one may not be so clear, right?
mm,
How does one sort of get up to speed, reading stuff about decarbonization, about aviation and marine, for example, which is important in Singapore.
mm.
So
Oh,
those are the two key things on the technical side. Now, obviously, on the softer side, which is very important as well, we typically look for conviction. So how does the person walk? And the best way to look through that is look over a long range of time. So if the person says, "Oh,
okay.
I'm actually really interested in decarbonization. I'm new to the industry, but for the last few years, I've been signing up for these various talks, these various courses on decarbonization. I personally, I'm a sailor myself because I'm really interested in the seas, and it's shocking that Singapore is such a successful port. But there's always an oil film in the water. There's always the
Yes. Oh,
smell
yes,
of
yes,
that
yes.
as
Yeah.
I'm failing. You see, so you see also that alignment between what they say professionally and how they behave personally.
Okay. Interesting. So, I presume one of the ways will be you will look at my LinkedIn profile to see what am I doing in my spare time to see whether am I really that convicted. Would you say that?
Yeah, so I think social media to some extent makes us all a little bit transparent, right?
Mm.
But the nature of social media is that it's ultimately self-curated. So it wouldn't be the only
Oh, okay.
reference point.
Yeah.
You tend to, want to put things on social media that are self-selecting. So I think we will probably look larger than that. So for
Mm,
example, what are some of the volunteer groups that you're part of? What
mm,
NGOs have you supported? We might ask a question about what's your take on plastic waste and how do you, personally, do you believe in recycling? Just asking a little bit of their personal motivations too, because it tends to be linked. I
mm.
remember, for example, that in my interview many eons ago, I think someone asked me about my favorite sports, and I love skiing and diving and scuba diving. And
Okay.
when I talk about these sports, and people ask you why, I would naturally say as part of it, I love to be in nature. You just feel so empowered when I'm in nature, right? Whether it's camping out, whether it's diving and seeing the beautiful reefs and just being at one with nature. So it kind of comes out, You don't really have to ask that many questions, but your conviction
Mm,
of things that you're passionate about usually comes out.
mm,
And
interesting.
maybe, Lionel, I can share a framework that again, I don't know a lot of the background of the audience here, but I'm sure that many of them may be keen to move towards the space or change roles, etc.
Yes. Yeah.
So I found, unlike other jobs, sustainability related jobs, okay, and it's important to make the distinction between sustainability as operational sustainability versus sustainable investing, right, which is about deploying capital. But suffice to say, both of them are usually somehow linked to an internal value. Very few people
Mm,
do
mhm, mhm,
sustainability
mhm,
jobs just because it's there. They're usually
mm.
linked to some kind of personal conviction, certain passion. So, I think some of you on the call may have read this book called Ikigai, Ikigai. It's actually a
Mhm.
Japanese concept, a simple framework that says the reason for being. And the idea being that if you can find a role which is at the sweet spot of four intersections, is it right? One, two, yeah, four
Yes,
intersections,
yes, yes. Yeah.
then it is really the ideal job, right? And the idea that the first intersection is what are you passionate about? Okay, so these questions that you're asking me, Lionel, is the fact that if I'm really passionate about nature, whether or not it's marine, whether or not it's terrestrial, that's something that's really important to me. Now, what you're passionate about, what do you want to do as the purpose of it, which is the externalization of that? Do I want to be a marine conservationist? Do I want to be a travel editor writing about the various problems with nature? Or do I want to be an investor that's investing in solutions that helps conserve the environment, right? That's your purpose. So that's how you externalize your passion. And then that passion and purpose should align with your strength. You may want to be, I meet a lot of people that say, oh, I would love to work for an impact fund. But then when I come to their strength and skill set, I say, do you even like numbers? Are you good with numbers? Do you like to look at investments? Do you like particularly to spend time due diligencing a company, looking at their accounts, looking at their revenue growth, their profitability, their models, and so forth? They say, no, I hate numbers. Then why would you then why would you want to work as an investor? You see? So those two things, that passion and purpose, needs to align with your pragmatic skill set. What are you good at and where do you want to be good at? Having said that, it doesn't mean that you have the skill set today. So as I shared in my introduction, I came from a legal skill set, and then I rounded it off with a investment skill set, and then through banking, and then finally moved to becoming an investor. So it was incremental. At the point I started, I didn't have that financial investment knowledge. So
Mhm,
you can
mhm,
build it,
mhm,
but it was something that I intentionally wanted to go towards. So I think when you think about your skill set, what are some skills that you would like to pick up? And like I mentioned earlier, using the example, the skills could be thematic. Some of you might be really interested in blended finance, where you are pairing, concessionary or philanthropic capital, right, with
mm,
investment capital in a way to multiply the effect for outcomes. Okay,
mhm,
to de-risk some of the early stage solutions in Asia. Some of you, like me, are super passionate about nature. You may be really concerned about biodiversity. If anyone has ever dived in Raja Ampat, Indonesia, you know that they're finding, a handful of new species every week. So you might
mm,
be very passionate about, you might even come from a non-finance background. You might be an engineer, you might be a scientist, and now you're trying to pivot to bring that science into an investment lens, right? So, the no pun intended, but it's really an open sea, right? You have the ocean and there's plenty of opportunities there. All I'm saying is please spend the time to think about your passion, your purpose, how that aligns with your skill set, and then look for the role. Quite
mm, mm,
often,
mm,
I have a
mm.
lot of people that's out of business school that try to look for the role and then try to reverse engineer all three.
Okay.
And that's when there's a lack of this, there's sometimes it comes across as lack of authenticity, lack of credibility.
Oh, yeah, yeah, I like this because the next question is related because then if someone discover that, look, I have this, I have that, I have, but I'm lacking in certain skills or lacking in certain certification. I presume one must do this homework first before they even consider looking for the school or looking for the institution that that covers such courses. Because correct me if I'm wrong, most of the courses out there is kind of generic.
Yeah, it's probably true. So I think I would say a few things. Like I said, there are three buckets that I mentioned earlier, right?
Mhm.
One is the functional capability. Now, the functional capability, your experience and your CV should show that. Whatever roles that you had in the past. Okay. So I don't need to talk about functional because that should be apparent from your experience, your reference letters, and from your CV. Now, when you're talking about sustainability thematic skill set, this is the one where I think there's no harm in doing a generic course because at least it gives you a bit of an overview, right? But then having done the generic course, focusing on something specific, whether it's decarbonization for a particular industry like aviation or maritime, whether or not it's looking at climate and specifically focused on climate solutions for the agricultural space, for example, right? These are usually things that are not available in a course because the industry is too dynamic, it's moving too quickly. So I think
Mm,
that's when I would advise for those of you that are interested in these thematics, keep up to date with various blogs, with various sites, with various influencers that are sort of deep in the space. Whether it's X or whether it's LinkedIn, people that are in that sector, they tend to post various learnings from the sector.
mhm,
I
mhm,
mean,
mhm.
practitioner-led learnings as opposed to theoretical-led learnings. And I think that's quite important because that shows you that you're keeping abreast of a changing industry. Okay.
Oh,
And
that's
then the
very good.
last one is really, when I mentioned on the softer side, right? These are your hobbies. These are your hobbies. These are your causes that you're supporting. That should be also pretty consistent as well. And that you can sometimes use your volunteer work. I know a lot of people that have entered the industry having done internships at various nonprofits and for-profit businesses in the social sector or social and environmental sector.
Oh, these are very good tips for someone who's thinking about whether they want to pivot in. So, if you're an engineer, right? So, is it true that the banks would rather take someone who's who's, let's say, an engineer who is in the, let's say, renewable resources to come in than someone who is fresh out of school, or what, how does one look at it? So which one will, which area should the hiring manager look at for these two different person?
Yeah, it's hard to be generic and broad brush with this answer because it's very, very
Sure,
specific
sure,
to
I'm
the
understand. Yeah.
organization, right? So
Mm-hmm.
what I will say is when you look at the JDs, because sustainable roles are generally getting, are getting mainstream,
Mm-hmm.
the job descriptions or the JDs are pretty accurate. Now, obviously, if I use my maritime or aviation example, those
Mm-hmm.
are highly technical supply chains, right? You
Okay.
just think about it, whether understanding how a plane broadly works, understanding whether or not the potential for sustainable aviation fuels, right, is actually possible, right? Someone with an engineering background is extremely useful for that.
Mm,
Okay.
okay.
So I would say that maybe to your earlier question, if it's more technical, if it's the real economy, something that does with a lot of science, something that has a lot of process involved with it, someone with an engineering background might be particularly well suited. Okay. But
Okay.
I've also met people in the investment space because don't forget, all these innovations need to be invested, right? Also
True.
met engineers go into investment roles because they've taken their technical skill set, in this case engineering, and they've put on a investment lens on top of it. So a lot of times, even when we do diligence, so as investors, maybe I talk a little bit about that, given that this is finance as well. So as investors, we really have you asked me earlier, my day-to-day life and as
Yes.
investor, it starts off from sourcing deals, screening deals, right? We do a lot of due diligence, trying to understand the business model, the team, trying to understand the product market fit, what's the addressable market, whether the solution is effective, so forth, right? And then eventually that's when we go to the investment stage, when we're deploying the capital together with all the documents and all the goals and the KPIs. And then as a private equity investor, that's when the fun begins because for the next 5 to 10 years, we are trying to work proactively with each company to create value, right? The value might be sometimes building governance, a better board, right? Trying to build up senior management higher. Sometimes it's trying to reduce costs, sometimes trying to open in new markets, right? So you're working very closely with them. You're not the entrepreneur, but you work very closely with them. And finally, you try to exit for a higher valuation. Now, something like that, for example, there's a lot of that process which requires technical expertise. So I see a lot of engineers, for example, they might be investors, but they might also be part of the operational value creation team.
Mm, mhm,
The ones that we
mhm,
send to each company to say, oh, how are we going to streamline this production? How are we going to, what are the costs that we can reduce? Because that's determined by the machine, right? How are we going to reduce the heat from here? How are we going to reduce the waste from here, right? How are we
mm,
going to substitute, fossil fuels here for renewables? So it's actually very technical. So that's why I'm saying I wouldn't rule it out, but I would spend time A, looking at the JD, the job description. B, I would spend time, if you can, with people already from that industry or working for that company, just to ask what the expectations are. And then I would try to align it just reading up a little bit about that industry and company. So, for example, if you're interested in aviation, as I mentioned, sustainable aviation fuel is a big thing right now. A lot of people
yes,
are discussing
yes,
it. Just
correct.
by a simple Google search, you can find many articles, pros and cons, right? So at least you're keeping up to speed with potentially what that role might encompass. Because we are riding on that mega trend of all businesses ultimately going towards low carbon and sustainable and operating sustainably.
Mm, good, good. Yeah, thanks for the answer. Well, let's run off everything, recap what you have said. So, what do you foresee as opportunities and challenge coming up within this few years?
So I'm very optimistic about Asia as a market for this, right?
Okay.
Sitting in Singapore, all of you already know how successful Singapore has been as a financial hub, as a hub for philanthropy, and hopefully as one of the leading, if not the leading, sustainable finance hub for Asia and the world, right? So I think, we are fortunate to have a strong government policy and regulators that really are driving this. That's quite rare actually, because if you look at ASEAN, the 10 sort of ASEAN countries, not all of them have proactive and robust policies as we do. Not all of them
Mm,
have
mm,
government with budgets to help push this, right?
mm.
We have an entire Ministry of Sustainability and Environment here, right, which is doing a lot of great things. So I think we should use that as a platform, and that's what sort of drives the growth of the market. Now, I'm optimistic that using Singapore as a platform, Asia or ASEAN is extremely interesting for this space because you have most of them are sort of emerging markets. So you have the rise of the emerging consumer. Most of them lack access to essential goods and services. That's when the impact is. And we have the
Mm,
ability, unlike our Western counterparts, to develop that in a sustainable way across the supply chain. Okay,
mm,
so I think there are only going to be more opportunities, not just for operational sustainability roles, but also sustainable investing roles. Because if you look at Asia, it's one of the fastest rising in terms of GDP per capita. It is also one that has a very young demographic. In some countries, the average age is less than 30, right?
yeah,
So a lot of
correct,
upside.
correct.
At the same time, we have super high mobile penetration. Some countries, you more than 100, which means more people have more than one phone. So, when you put all this together, the influence of technology, the ability to drive essential goods and services in a sustainable, responsible, and a highly impactful way, you have a plethora of opportunities that are only going to grow in Asia. And this is, I'm essentially only talking about ASEAN. You haven't even talked about India and China.
Yes, yes, the
Right.
biggest
So I
economy.
think the future is very, very bright from a growth potential for this sector and for therefore for roles. But I think the downside is that, as I mentioned earlier, the sector needs to mature. It needs to move away from just talking about, broad,
Mm,
shallow, thematics. It needs to
mhm,
move to technical excellence and execution. And that's
mm,
where hopefully I'm very optimistic of the talent that's on this call. I hope many of you will play a part in that because it's a particularly interesting opportunity that's very meaningful. But Asia has a real opportunity to lead on this, right?
mm,
So I think that challenge of being authentic, that challenge of being technically deep in a sector as opposed to talking in broad terms, the ability to think along solutions. I think one thing Singapore is very good at is very highly intelligent workforce, but sometimes, we're sometimes criticized on not being the most innovative. And I think that's where the next generation really has the ability to drive the innovation because, we are solving for the unknown unknowns.
Hope
Okay.
true. Yeah,
And that's very
absolutely. We are
important
putting it.
because,
Yeah.
yeah, because a lot of times when sustainability started, I mentioned that it's about doing something today such that future generations thrive, right? The truth is, in the macro environment with this geopolitical uncertainty, with all these climate compounding risk and uncertainties, we're trying to help look around the corner. And we're not just trying to look around the corner, we're trying to solve the challenges ahead. So you always got to keep future focused. You got to really focus on that innovation piece because the innovation piece is where I think we have the extremely interesting opportunity of solving things at scale and
Mm.
hopefully in a profitable way. Because if you can solve in a profitable way, naturally there'll be scale to it.
Wow. Okay. Thanks. Thanks. Wow. I look at the time. Wow. Time flies when you're having a good time. Well, I think at this point in time, shall we address some questions that come up from the Q&A box? Are you
Sounds
up to
good.
it?
My favorite part.
Okay. Someone asked, how do you measure or evaluate the returns for sustainable finance? Does your client take a different investment horizon when they are investing in public and private? Well, it's a mouthful. How does that translate to deliveries in job openings?
Wow,
Yeah,
that's a well thought out
very
question,
good
very good
question.
one.
Yeah, yeah.
Not an easy one to explain, but I'm glad you asked it because remiss in what I mentioned. I talked about legal compliance. I talked about product. There's a whole entire set of roles about ESG metrics reporting, impact reporting, metrics, and all that stuff. You know, in in
Mm,
in short, we call it the IMM, impact measurement and management type of frameworks, right?
mhm,
And obviously, I think to your first distinction, it's a very astute one because obviously, if you're in the public markets, as you know, public markets talks about things which are traded very frequently. So a
mm,
lot of companies, for example, that are listed, SGX is driving a lot of this, have to make ESG disclosures. They have to make environmental risk management disclosures, climate disclosures. So there's an entire set of roles that are focused on that. Now, in the private markets, the difference is that we also tend to collect the data quarterly. They tend to be reported annually, but it's less quick because the nature of private markets is that they're not listed on exchange. And
mm,
one distinction I wanted to draw here, which I hope you will remember, in addition to the ABC framework that I
mhm,
gave
mhm,
you, is
mhm,
what is the difference between ESG and impact? Now,
mm,
they overlap, so the distinction is not black and white, but generally speaking, if you look at ESG, and that discussion really grew from the public markets, right, which are very quick tradable cycles, we're really talking about the measurement of outputs every quarter. So it could be energy consumption, waste consumption, diversity, governance, where's my power being sourced, what's my carbon footprint, right? So ESG largely is driven by outputs and they're probably reported quarterly, if not sooner. Whereas impact, you're really driving long-term outcomes. Are you solving poverty? Are you
mhm.
reducing gender inequality? Are you providing, livelihood creation for smallholder farmers? They're not things that can be measured quarterly. They're measured
Yes,
over
correct.
years. Okay.
Mhm,
So quite often, in addition to the ABC framework, I always say look at the microscope and the telescope. The ESG, being output oriented and shorter term, tends to focus like a microscope.
mm,
Okay.
mm,
Whether that microscope is looking at a company level, whether it's looking at a fund level, and so forth, right? But
mm,
the impact is the long-term outcome. So it's like the telescope. So you want to be able, at least from a good investor's point of view, to use the microscope and the telescope together.
mm,
Okay. And obviously, in the private markets, you're probably using more of the microscope, and sorry, in the public markets, more of the microscope, in the private markets, more of the telescope. Okay.
yeah.
But you're right in asking me that question because there are a whole bunch of metrics out there. If I start describing them, it will take up even longer than this call, so I wouldn't.
Yes.
But I would at least point you to the fact that if you search impact measurement and management frameworks, you're going to have many. If you search sustainability and ESG frameworks and reporting, you have a lot of things to read. But there's and everyone is ultimately trying to decipher and come to a form of standardized and consistent metrics. Okay. That we're not there yet. And that's again, if you ask me challenges, that's one of the challenges with the
Mm,
sustainability and the impact space,
mm,
that there's not a uniform, standardized, and consistent metric. Okay.
mm,
And unfortunately, when you deal with long-term outcomes, they're very subjective. You can increase the livelihood of smallholder farmers in Indonesia and Philippines, but that's very different from China and India.
mm,
Okay,
mm.
same model. So yeah, so I think devil's in the detail, but at least hopefully I've answered your question of where to look, and at least if you're interested in types of roles in that space, there's quite a lot of a growing body of potential roles in that sector.
Okay, great. The next question I think we touched on a little bit is about, people want to know, how do I get my foot or my into the door if I'm into asset management, if I'm not from the sector? Any
Mm.
suggestion?
So yeah, so this one is never easy. I've done it,
Mm.
and a few of my friends have
Yeah,
done it. It's
you've
never
done it,
easy.
correct,
Now,
yes.
the key thing when you transfer to a sector that's quite technical, like finance, yeah, law is also very technical. I think, arguably, I actually think from a law to go to banking is easier than a banker to go to a lawyer. But
Yes.
they're both technical. I guess my point is you need to convince your future employer in that sector that you have the foundational knowledge and you have the ability to learn. Okay. So for me, in my case, when I transferred from law to banking, I actually did so there are various courses out there. The popular ones at that point of time was the CFA, the Chartered Financial Analyst, and then another one called the CAIA, Chartered
PAIA,
Alternative
correct.
Investment Analyst. So I chose to go for the CAI, which I obtained after I think 1.5 years, simply because it only took 1.5 years in two levels. I heard nightmare stories about CFA taking 3 years. The
Yes,
pass rate was
yes,
so
and
low
more.
that people took on average 5, if not more years. So I did it out of pragmatic idea to try to get some accreditation. So I guess first point for those of you that are not from a sector trying to go into a sector, say if it's finance, I think it's always helpful to at least have some financial credentials. It doesn't have to be the CFA, CAIA. It could be a e-learning course at Harvard or one of the schools that's strong in finance that shows
Mhm,
at
mhm,
least
mhm,
your basic
mhm.
foundational knowledge. And then building on basic financial knowledge, cater it for the role that you're seeking to have. So, for example, if you're applying for an ESG analyst role, then I would obviously understand what are the things that typically we look at in evaluating companies, right? But focus more on the ESG because that role is for ESG. So, try to find out how it links to that, right? Like I mentioned earlier about carbon. I mean, now that Singapore is one of the first few countries in the world that has a carbon tax, it actually hits your bottom line. So if you were a stock analyst a few years ago, you wouldn't have to factor the impact of carbon pricing on your industry, but now you do. So
Mm,
you have the
mm,
ability to bring in the non-financial, right, the ESG stuff, in addition to your foundational knowledge in finance. And I think that's really the key because a lot of employers that already have a lot of folks that have finance, they find it very hard to change them to ESG analysts. So you might have a better chance having a foundational knowledge and building the ESG knowledge on top of that, because at least you come with it with an open mind, which is very important because I'm saying we're trying to look round corners for unknown unknowns. So we don't know what is coming.
oh, great. Okay, I mean, I think most of the question are into that line because someone asked, as an early careerist profession, you know, what kind of courses that they would take. Is it from, like ESG investing courses at SUSS? Would it help? Or maybe a CFI cert from IBF? Okay, that would help, of course. From IBF.
Yes, I gotta do a pitch for IBF. IBF has tremendous courses in this space. In addition to the wonderful courses that IBF have, you also have a lot of them. You have WMI, right? If you come from the private banking or asset management industry, there's Wealth Management Institute courses. The universities have them. All these centers of excellence are housed out of the universities, whether it's NTU, SMU, NUS, they all have courses in this space. All I'm saying is don't do an overkill of those courses.
Mm,
Do enough to get that foundational knowledge, and then try to build on the things above that foundational course, which is role specific and organizational specific. Okay,
mm,
so like I mentioned, putting on the ESG metrics for public markets, maybe, but maybe focus if you want to focus on a particular sector like maritime or aviation, add in that. And you're not going to find that in a course.
mm, mm. Okay. Yeah. So, are you interested in a case study question? Because someone actually gave you a case study
Oh,
to
wow.
answer.
Okay.
Well, okay,
Try me.
before I read out the case,
Okay.
I'm gonna call upon my colleague to launch a poll. This is the poll that we do all the time so that we can get some idea on what type of webinars or what kind of in conversation series that you would like to hear moving forward, and whether this round is a good session for you, so that you have something to take back with, which is what we always want to happen. That at the end of the day, you have something that you can take back with you. That you learn something, you get exposed to something. You know. So thank you. This poll will just take a little few seconds of your time, but it does help us to prepare for future engagement and to know, what type of people we should invite, such as Ern, because, so that we can do it. Okay, so the case study question is, so this person is currently helping to raise capital for 1,000 acres project farm project in Africa. Okay, very high tech, zero waste, sustainable, integrated eco team. It satisfies and meets all 17 of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Okay, so that's the question. If you are this person, how will you go about raising capital for the project? And could you offer any other advice regarding this project?
Sure. That could take an entire
I
hour.
know, right? So I say,
But
would you be
no, thank you for
interested
asking
to?
that. No, thank you for asking that questions. I just to resonate with where I find the value of these courses, of these webinars, is because it's quite rare to get a practitioner's time here. So I don't think all my answers have been kosher, but I can definitely tell you that it's what practitioners, feel. And I think
Mm,
sometimes there's a disconnect when you apply for jobs. A lot of it's theoretical, it's not pragmatic, right?
mm, 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 mm.
So that's why these sessions are helpful. So thank you for asking things to bring us back to the ground, because the ground is where it's important. Okay. So I would say that generally with any investment, you need to look at the macro. And I think sometimes people get that wrong, because I think the first level that you should think about is who are investors that like Africa? Because I just told you in this geopolitical risk, with all
Mm,
these uncertainties going on, the very first thing is not even about the project or the team. It's just the fact that they cannot deploy to Africa.
mm,
So I would do firstly find out what type of investors can invest in Africa. And you haven't told me enough about the project. I don't know whether it's a private equity type project, it's something listed. I don't know what's the size. I need to know the land size. I don't know what's the size of the company. It's very,
mm,
very different, right? So I would say that try to do a mapping of investors that I'm assuming are based in Asia and Singapore. So try to find Asian investors that are looking at Africa. Okay. If you can narrow it down to agriculture, even better. The closer you are to the target, the more likely you have a higher chance of fundraising or conversion. Then, having said that, you should look at also a little bit of speak to the people that have raised successfully previous projects. Obviously, what's in your favor is for the ones that can take emerging market African risk. It's an extremely important market, like I said with ASEAN or Latin America. These are growth markets. They're complex markets, but they're growth markets. So understanding that that's in your favor. The second one is food security, sustainable agriculture is another major megatrend. We are living in a situation where, we just can't feed enough, right? I mean, and sadly, I don't want to get involved in that, but there's a counter argument that it's just too much food waste. But there's another solution in producing more productivity and ensuring that supply chain is sustainable and growing. So I don't know what crop you're growing. Again, that matters as well. But
mhm,
I would
mhm,
add two or three things that I think is important. Now, in addition to selling the food and agriculture story, which is very compelling, most of these agricultural farms are starting to build in the carbon component, right? Because all of them need to build on land. So whether or not they're having agroforestry or they're planting trees or they're planting, we have a project in Philippines where we have over 20 million cacao trees, right? And that model is already profitable. But now all the carbon in those newly planted trees can actually be monetized. And you can use that model to actually pass it down to the farmers, which again drives productivity and yield. So my first point of reference is try to build in the carbon component and try to build in the climate solutions component. They're interlinked. because that would make your existing agriculture model even more compelling from those other perspectives. So I don't know whether again, I can't talk too much about this. I haven't seen the project. I'm just saying that these are some of the things where I've seen in other type of similar things. Try to narrow the scope of investors that are interested in your market in that sector. Try to find alignment both on the type of investment, right? Is it debt you're raising? Is it equity? Is it venture capital? So forth. And then at the same time, try to make your business model compelling by building the climate and carbon angle to it, because it's a very part of the growth story of businesses like that. I hope
Mm,
that's helpful.
I think so. I mean, that's that's more than more than asked for. Okay, so unfortunately, everything must come to an end, and this webinar is going to come to an end very soon. But before we go, do you have any parting words or encouragement for the people out there?
Well, I think do we know how many people have signed up, Lionel, here?
I got to look at it, but
Okay.
over 100 people is attending this meeting right now.
Awesome. So that itself is amazing to hear in the sense that 100 of you have signed up for this. So I feel very optimistic, as I mentioned, about the future generations, and I'm sure many of you here. And I wish you all the best of luck in trying to find a meaningful role in the sustainability or the sustainable investment sector. We need talent like you. So, I hope that you can hopefully do the map where you're tracking your passion, your
Mhm.
purpose, your skill set, and then look for a meaningful role. Try to find your ikigai and that sweet spot, and try to meaningfully deploy, your talent, whether it's your social capital, your networks, whether it's your intellectual capital, your knowledge, or it's your financial capital, the funds that you work for. Because the space really needs all three, because we have a real challenge to solve
Mm.
for effective solutions that can scale. And we're unfortunately losing that, as you see with all the climate events that have been compounding in our region,
Yes, yes.
right?
The webinar has come to an end. Look forward to seeing you guys in subsequent events. Thank you.
See you all soon.
Bye. Yeah.
Enjoy the afternoon.